Welcome, everyone. My name is Tani Schwartz-Herman. I'm so pleased to welcome you to our Monday webinar series, Timely Insights, Timeless Wisdom. Welcome any first-time attendees for our Monday webinar series. I want to welcome you to today's session with Dr. Alan Cooper, Praying for the Peace of Jerusalem. And today's session is in commemoration of Yom Hazikaron, Israel's Memorial Day for fallen soldiers and victims of terror. And as we all know, this year is a particularly difficult day for us to commemorate. We'll hear more in a little while from Dr. Cooper. I want to just remind everyone, just about a couple of announcements. I want to remind everyone that we had a schedule change. Next week's session will be featuring a guest speaker, Dr. Elias Sachs, Director of the Jewish Publications Society, on a session entitled Gender, the Bible, and the Art of Translation. And Dr. Ben Summers' session will be on June 3rd as a pre-Shavuot session. Today's session is generally sponsored at the Navi level by Yael Asbel, JTS trustee. If you're feeling inspired by this opportunity to learn with JTS's outstanding scholars, we invite you to partner with us by sponsoring a learning session. We offer 3 sponsorship levels, and we'll be posting a link in the chat and some more information about that. Just to go over the format of our session, we'll pause for questions periodically throughout the class. Please send your questions for Professor Cooper to me, and during the Q&A period, I will select a few of the questions to present to Dr. Cooper. Since we receive a lot of questions, kindly express your question both clearly in complete sentences and also concisely. The sources for today's class were in the email that you received earlier today, and we'll be screen sharing that as well. And I'm so pleased to introduce Dr. Alan Cooper, Elaine Ravich Professor of Jewish Studies. He served as Provost of JTS from 2007 to 2018. Dr. Cooper's publications include many articles on biblical poetics and the history of interpretation. His work in progress includes a commentary on Psalms 31 through 60 for the Jewish Publication Society. And I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Cooper.
Thank you very much, Tani. I'd like to begin with a bracha. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. It's such a privilege to be able to fulfill the mitzvah of teaching and learning Torah with you. And of course, like Tani, I would like to acknowledge the gravity of today's ceremonies for Yom HaZikaron, particularly amidst all the turmoil of our days. It's such a privilege to be able to have this time to study with you, even amidst all of that turmoil. I would like to thank my colleagues in the Community Engagement Department, particularly Tani and Stacy, for assisting me in this teaching and for all the wonderful work that they do in order to make teaching and learning possible. I want to apologize for having lost my voice, but I'll do the best that I can under the circumstances. So I'd like to begin our discussion of Jerusalem with an image that I'm going to share. And let's see. I don't know if you don't see that yet. Let me share this image. Oh well.
Dr. Cooper, if you're having trouble with the share, you can, if you'd like, you can send it to me and I can share it for you.
I will. Thank you very much. I'll get it. I'll get it up in a moment.
Okay.
Just will take me a moment to do this. Okay, that should work. Okay, there it is. Can all see that? Okay, well, this, uh, I was reminded about this in planning for today's session. Uh, this is a poster that I purchased during a visit to Jerusalem, in the summer of 1977. And I still think that it's very beautiful. And you can't read the inscription on it, but what it says actually is Jerusalem all around in Hebrew and in English. And then at the bottom it says 10 years of the reunification of Jerusalem, because this poster was commissioned to commemorate the 10th anniversary of the unification of Jerusalem in the 1967 war. And it represented a moment of great optimism in the direction of the possibility of reunification, not only in a political and geographical sense, but also in the sense that the people of Jerusalem would be able to come together with some sort of sense of unity, a consummation devoutly to be wished, but one that didn't actually occur in reality. And it represents nothing more than an ongoing hope for peace and unity in Jerusalem. Will see that that's a hope and aspiration that goes all the way back into the biblical period and into the medieval reception of biblical sayings about the city of Jerusalem. In the United States, there are at least 18 cities that are called by the name Zion. And of course, none of them is actually in physical Jerusalem, but each one of them is in the minds of the people who name the cities a kind of Jerusalem in its own right, a kind of mythic Jerusalem, a kind of virtual Jerusalem. And the reason that so many places are named after Jerusalem is because of the history of its reception and because of the way in which Jerusalem came to be understood not only as a geographical place on Earth, but also as a kind of a mythic a mythic trope and a myth that symbolizes not just place, but also two particular aspects of religious place. One, the presence of God, the notion of a place where God is present, physically or spiritually present. And second, the notion of peace, the notion that it's not just a place of presence where God is, but it's a place that manifests peace. Both of these are derived from the biblical images of Jerusalem and then transformed into myths of Jerusalem that are transportable and that can be turned into religious manifestations in many places other than the geographical spot. We can see this tendency already emerging, not only in the Jewish literature, but also I'd like to call your attention to uh, uh, Christian texts that also relate to this image. Let me point to a couple of them. This is the book of Hebrews, chapter 12. You have come to Mount Zion, to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem. I want you to give a moment of thought to that. The notion that this Mount Zion is not the geographical place that's on the earth, but rather a figurative place, a mythic place, a place that could in principle be located anywhere, the heavenly Jerusalem, where thousands upon thousands of angels in joyful assembly. To the church of the firstborn whose names are written in heaven, you have come to God, the judge of all, to the spirits of the righteous made perfect. So that is a clear early indication of the way the notion of Jerusalem is mythicized so that it could be spiritually present in any spot on earth, which explains why you have all of these synagogues and churches named for Zion. and why you have places that are named for Zion. And here's another New Testament text, New Heaven and New Earth, which talks about the first heaven and the first earth that passed away. There was no longer any sea. I saw the holy city, the New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride, beautifully dressed for her husband. Well, I don't have to tell you how familiar those images will be to Jews. There's nothing particularly Christian about those images, but what they manifest is the a complete transformation of the physical geographical Jerusalem into the mythic trope of Jerusalem that manifests God's presence and the peace that is symbolized by Jerusalem anywhere. And that explains all of the different places that are named Jerusalem or Zion. Now, what I'd like to do is I'd like to sing a little song that manifests that, one that's familiar probably to many of you. It goes like this. Come, fathers and mothers, come, sisters and brothers, come, join us in singing the praises of Zion, the praises of Zion. Come, fathers, won't you be determined to walk within the walls of Zion? We'll shout and go round, we'll shout and go round, we'll shout and go round, we'll shout and go round the walls of Zion, the walls of Zion. You may know that from the way it was set for piano and voice or for orchestra and voice by Aaron Copland. And it is a 19th century revivalist tune. It was sung at camp meetings, and those camp meetings, wherever they were sung, they were Zion. They were Zion right here on earth, the figurative place of Zion and the walls of Zion, understood as a result of the mythicization of the geographical city of Jerusalem in post-biblical times. Now I want to talk about how that came about. By sharing a whole bunch of texts with you that come from within our tradition, not the Christian tradition or the revivalist tradition, beginning with the actual building of the temple in the city of Jerusalem. So you should see on screen a nice large printed text of 2 Chronicles chapter 3, verse 1. Solomon began to build the house of Adonai in Yerushalayim on Mount Moriah, where Adonai had appeared to his father David, at the place which David had designated at the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite. So you have two different geographical designations for the place where the temple is going to be built, and you have the location of the places attributed implicitly to one biblical character and explicitly to another. Mount Moriah is only mentioned here as location of the temple for the first time here in 2 Chronicles. So what we're obviously doing is witnessing the way in which the Bible is moving away from the purely geographical designation of Jerusalem as the site of the temple to a figurative designation that connects it with the biblical story. So what happened on Mount Moriah, you all know. That's the location where the Akedah took place, the sacrifice of Isaac or the near sacrifice of Isaac, depending on which version of the tradition you're familiar with. And that happened there. And so the temple is not only this location discerned by David, but also commemorative of the Akedah, which embeds it in the very fabric of the Jewish relationship with God. So Har HaMoriah, and we see elaborations of this in later commentary. So here's the commentary by Malbim, the great 19th century commentator, who elaborates on what David actually did in the light of rabbinic commentary on that text in Chronicles. Something I should say at the outset about Chronicles is that the David of Chronicles is not the David of the books of Samuel and Kings. The David of Chronicles is the figure we might start to be calling the proto-Messiah. That is to say, we're moving away from the historical David in the direction of the future David, who is going to be the messianic figure ushering in the kingdom of God. And the Book of Chronicles does that by whitewashing David's biography and also by making him increasingly responsible for the invention of Israel's cult and religion. David, who is going to be basically responsible for the temple, even though Solomon built it. And we know David as the author of the temple liturgies, the Psalms, some of which are actually recited in the Book of Chronicles. So David locates the temple by means of a fire that descended from heaven. This is new. This is not the way in which it's represented in the Bible, but it is revelation by fire of the sort that we're familiar with from many biblical texts, including the giving of the Ten Commandments at Sinai, right? Which is accompanied by a revelation of storm, thunder, and lightning, a fire revelation. It's possible that when it is said, on the Mount of Adonai there is vision, what's that? That's the name that Abraham has given to this mountain. It's the source of Moriah. The wordplay, Yera'eh, Moriah, gives the mountain its name, and God will appear there in the future, and God's presence will be revealed in the temple, because that is where Isaac was bound. So we hear the mythical connection of the site of the temple with the Akedah that then becomes a basis for our worship and for our understanding of the significance of the Akedah as a kind of prefiguration of temple sacrifice. And so when on Rosh Hashanah, our liturgy calls upon God to remember the ashes of Isaac heaped on the altar on our behalf for our benefit, you can see that a collocation of temple imagery with Akedah imagery. And here, what Malbim does is elaborates on the function of David as having primary responsibility for so much of the temple, even though he was not technically allowed to build it. And this is part of the aggrandizement of David as the proto-messianic figure. He prepared the place. He dug the foundations. He hewed out the drain pipes. These are very important. The shittim, which figure prominently in the mythology of Jerusalem. And as the sages said, and that's why the place is called Makom David, the place of David, because of his zeal to build the temple on the site that he found by means of the divine revelation. A further connection of the temple with the Akedah and the whole city of Jerusalem comes in this magnificent midrash from Genesis Rabbah, which is on the place name that Abraham gave to the site following the Akedah, Adonai Yireh, God will see, or God will be seen, God will be envisioned, which we have here. So God called the place Adonai Yireh, and there's a lengthy description of how Abraham conquers his compassion in order to obey God and offer Isaac as a sacrifice. And now there's a prayer of God. So, Yehi Ratzon milfanecha Adonai Eloheinu. May it be your will, O God, that when the children of Isaac fall into transgression and evil, let this Akedah be remembered for their sake, and may you be filled with compassion for them. This is what we find in our Rosh Hashanah liturgy, right? Shehayu banav shel Yitzchak ba'im lidei averot u'ma'asim ra'im. When we come into transgressions and evil deeds, tahei nizkar lahem, otah ha'akedah, let that Akedah be remembered on their behalf, and may you, God, be filled with compassion for them. So then the Midrash continues. Abraham named the site Yireh, he shall see, the place of seeing, but Shem, who is equated by the Midrash with Melchizedek, called it Salem, Shalem, in Genesis 14, which we'll look at in a moment. God thought, you have to love when the Midrash characterizes what God has on God's mind. If I call it Yireh, as Abraham did, then the righteous Shem will complain. If I call it Salem, the righteous Abraham will complain. Therefore, I'll name it Jerusalem. Jeru from Yireh, Salem from Salem, in accordance with both of them. And you can see it in Hebrew. Kemo she kara'u shnehem Yireh Shalem Yerushalayim. Isn't that a delightful etymology of the name of Jerusalem? But it's worth an excursion for a few minutes to talk about where the name really comes from and what some of the pre-Israelite background of Jerusalem is. So what about the meaning of the Salem or Shalem element in Jerusalem, especially when we see that that Shalem element figures prominently in other names that are associated with the city? Shlomo, Solomon, of course, is the third king in Jerusalem following David, and Absalom of Shalom. Well, you may not be surprised to learn that the Shalem element is actually the name of an old Canaanite deity, and that he must have been, this deity, or she must have been, one of the patron deities of the city in its pre-Israelite existence, because of course Jerusalem was much older than the Israelite occupation. So what is the etymology of the name? In all likelihood, the Yeru element comes from an old Semitic determinative uru that simply means city, and Shalem is the name of the patron deity of the city. Do we know anything about Shalem? Yes, we do, because from the old Canaanite text from Ugarit, we have a divine pair who are named Shachar and Shalem, which means dawn and dusk, and those are figures for Venus as the morning and evening star. So, in all likelihood, the ancient pre-Israelite deity of the city of Jerusalem was Venus as the evening star, Shalem signifying the completion of the day, and that then gets refigured into the Shalem element, which will be reinterpreted, as we'll see, as the tradition unfolds. So the city of Shalem, the city of this ancient deity, figures both in the name of the city and the name of important figures who are associated with the city, Shlomo and Avshalom, who bear the name of the deity. Shalom, the meaning of Avshalom, would simply mean Shalem is father. But it can be refigured or reinterpreted in the light of the Shalom element as having something to do with peace. Here's the verse that talks about Shalem in relation to Melchizedek. King Melchizedek of Shalem brought out bread and wine. He was a priest of God Most High, Kohen La'el Elyon. And the identity of El Elyon is a mystery, but obviously in the course of the biblical tradition, El Elyon is being identified with Israel's God Adonai, despite the God originally probably being of non-Israelite origin. Now, I want to see how surprisingly the mythical elements that are here in that verse and in the underlying traditions about Jerusalem are also found in the great 13th century commentary of Ramban on this verse in Genesis chapter 14. So let's look at this commentary on the verse. King Melchizedek of Shalem, namely Yerushalayim, as it says in Psalm 76, as it says, Vayhi b'Shalem Sukkot, God's abode. You'll recognize that word Sukkot from Sukkot, the booth which also is a mini temple and can be a signifier of the temple in Psalm 76. In the time of Joshua, the king of the city was Adoni Tzedek, Now, isn't that interesting? Because another one of those Phoenician deities who was roaming around the territory there is a deity whose name, according to the Phoenician chronographer Philo of Byblos, is Suduk, which is the Phoenician word for tzedek. So the Lord Tzedek is another prominent ancient deity associated with Jerusalem, but we all know that Tzedek isn't just the name of a deity, it's also the common noun that refers to justice and righteousness. So Tzedek, not as the name of a deity, but as the concept of justice and righteousness, also has a primordial association with Jerusalem. So Jerusalem, the abode of the temple, is also the place of tzedek, as it will become the place of shalom, the place of peace. Now, this is just remarkable because what we're doing is deriving these concepts associated with the city from the names of the ancient pre-Israelite deities who had been associated with the city, but the identity of those deities is long lost in their refiguration as concepts, the concept of justice associated with the city and the concept of peace. All the nations recognized that Jerusalem was the choicest of all habitable locations, or else they had a tradition that it was distinguished by its correspondence with the heavenly temple. This also is this messianic notion of the entire world representing the centrality of Jerusalem to the whole world. Ki mitzion tetzei Torah, because all instruction flows forth from Jerusalem and all nations wish to flow there. According to Genesis Rabbah, the place justifies its inhabitants, makes them just. Matzdik. You see the Midrash and Ramban playing on the name of the old deity, transforming it into a verb, and attributing a quality to the city of Jerusalem by virtue of the word play. Jerusalem is called Tzedek, the place where righteousness dwelt. Shene'emar Tzedek Yalin Ba. So you could personify Tzedek. Tzedek, the God righteousness, dwells within her, but of course, we're now talking about a concept being repersonified. Isn't that ironic? You start out with an actual pre-Israelite deity, then you turn the deity into a figure of speech, and then you repersonify it as a quality or characteristic of the city, according to Isaiah 1. In the opinion of our rabbis, who say that Melchizedek, Melchizedek was Shem, son of Noah, he went from his own country to Jerusalem to worship there. So he's a primordial pilgrim long before there was ever a temple there. I think I'm going to stop right now and see if there are questions or comments about where we've come so far.
Thanks, Dr. Cooper. I'm Ellie Gettinger. I'm going to be facilitating the
Good. Thank you,
Q&A
Ellie.
section. It's nice to see you. Could you unshare your screen for this part, if you
I
don't?
sure will. I have to
Wonderful.
first move the.
Great.
Did you do that or did I do that?
I
You
just
might have
took it. I took it down for you.
Thank you.
Sure.
I think we have, from a historical standpoint, I think we have this kind of sense of Jerusalem. There's nothing there before the Joshua's conquest, and so you're kind of dealing with a new sense of, you're providing us a new sense of geography here. So could you kind of go into the following? This seems to suggest the city of Jerusalem existed as a thriving city before the Jews. Was it conquered and conquested, or was it a process of, like, was there an official conquest of Jerusalem, or is there something else that's at play here?
No, Jerusalem wasn't conquered, but Jerusalem was there. It was identified as a Jebusite city, and one might argue then that Suduk and Shalem were the Jebusite gods of the city, and it was taken over by the Judeans, taken over by David, and it was became the capital of the United Kingdom because of its central location and its easily defensible location as well. But there was a city there prior to its expansion, which is a matter of great controversy from an archaeological point of view, because there are disputes over the dating of certain periods of expansion. One thing that's beyond question is that by the 8th century, Jerusalem was gaining in prosperity and expanding, and ultimately it becomes the site of the capital city of the Judean monarchy and the site of the temple. But whether that happened as far back as the 10th century, in the time of David, is a matter of debate among archaeologists and historians. The city was there. It had a certain status within among the Canaanite city-states, and it was taken over to become the seat of the Judean monarchy, which it remained.
Mm-hmm.
Is that enough information?
Yeah,
I'm
no,
not
I
sure.
think I think that it just is like, and I think now that I'm playing through, my David history, that this is coming to, but it's like you're putting together a lot of pieces in one space that were newer to me.
I didn't want to go too much into the historical dispute, because
Yeah.
I'm one of these agnostics about the historical David and Solomon, and see the actual rise of Israelite polity only in the 9th century, not in the 10th century, with Judean expansion happening only primarily after the Assyrian conquest of the northern kingdom. But that would lead us too far astray from today's topic, so I don't want to go into that in more detail.
Fair enough. In what period did the term Zion evolve from referring to Jerusalem, a specific place, to referring to both the kind of entirety of the land of Israel and this kind of metaphorical concept?
Well, Jerusalem is built on 2 mountains. And if you look at the historical information about them, you'll find that 3 different places have been called Zion. One of them is just what's also known as Ir David, the city of David, which would be that core portion of Jerusalem that goes back to the 9th or 10th century. The other is one of the 2 hills, the Eastern Hill or the Western Hill. Nowadays, the Western Hill is the one that's called Har Zion, Mount Zion. But the Eastern Hill was also referred to that way. So it's very complicated, and it's also easy to say, on the basis of biblical poetic parallelism, Zion equals Jerusalem. So in some way, the 2 become equivalent terms. And when one refers to Zion, generally speaking, one is referring to Jerusalem, unless you say Har Zion, in which in modern parlance, you'd be referring to the western mountain of the 2 mountains on which Jerusalem was built. Once again, confusing things for the sake of clarity. But another interesting thing is that the etymology of the word Sion is up for considerable debate too. Nobody really knows what it means. But whether that, how much significance that has, is unclear for the subsequent figuration of Zion as the place of presence and peace.
And as a reminder, when we're talking about the 9th and 10th century, we're talking about before the Common Era, not the 9th and 10th century, when Jerusalem was already very much an established city, and Crusaders were coming, and there were all sorts of things going on.
That's right. That's exactly the beginning of the Crusader era.
I had a little bit of a visceral reaction, and I don't know that I definitely always had the sense that yes, the Akeda takes place on Mount Moriah, the temple is on Mount Moriah, and I don't know that I'd ever really put it together. But it's there's a little bit of a squick factor about that. And is it a recasting for me? Is there, I see the relevance, the connection, but it also feels a little yucky, at least personally. I wanted to know if there was ways in which commentators had either acknowledged that this is kind of a strange connection, or if they felt that it was just, yep, sacrifice, all good.
Well, first of all, you can't, you have to start with the biblical identification of the temple site with Moriah. So in other words, it's not a figment of the commentator's imagination. They have to deal with that. And the significance of that, which I tried to explain in passing in talking about the Rosh Hashanah liturgy, is the way the Akedah, instead of being a one-off, becomes the prototype for a sacrifice that takes place as the ultimate test of faith, which then is supposed to be refigured as our ultimate test of faith, whatever it is, whether it be, God forbid, going and offering a child in sacrifice, which is just an extreme example of sacrifice, but a model of sacrifice that we're supposed to emulate in some way in our own relationship with God. And even if that just represents a pondering of what is it that you are willing to give up for the sake of what? Or ask yourself, what are you willing to die for? What are you willing to kill for, God forbid? I think that the Akedah story is supposed to put those thoughts in our head. And yeah, it is supposed to make you squirm. And I don't think that, I think the story in its Genesis location is supposed to make you squirm. The whole concept of sacrifice is supposed to make you squirm. And the personalization of it, Davka, is not going to make you comfortable.
Well, I think we probably should keep moving forward.
Okay, and when there are questions from the group, I'll certainly welcome them. But now I want to come to the principal text of our presentation, which is Psalm 122. And it's the one that Tani mentioned as the title of our talk, which is a Shir HaMa'alot. It belongs to the category of songs of ascents in the latter portion of the book of Psalms. And the meaning of that term is not entirely certain. Some people think that they're ma'alot are some kind of figurative ascension. Some people think they're literally psalms that were sung while people mounted the staircase on the way to their temple there's a temple during their pilgrimage. But whatever the case, I'm going to talk about Psalm 122 in the light of the 13th century, 14th century commentary of David Kimchi, who views it as a song of yearning, nostalgia and yearning for those of us who live in the diaspora in the days following the destruction of the temple. But first, let's look at the psalm itself. Samachti be'omrim li Beit Adonai nelech. I was happy, I rejoiced when they said to me, we shall go, or let us go, could be translation, to the house of Adonai. Omdot hayu raglenu b'sha'arayich Yerushalayim habenuyah. Our feet would stand within your gates, O Jerusalem, Jerusalem built up. Ki'ir shechubra la yachtav. This is why I showed you the poster at the beginning of our talk, like a city that was all joined together. Chubra la yachtav, a city united. The meaning of it in the context of the psalm is not clear. We'll look at what Kimchi says. Afterwards. Shasham alu shvatim shivteya edut liYisrael. The tribes would make pilgrimage there. They would ascend there. That's related also possibly to the Shir HaMa'alot. We talk about ascent to Jerusalem as migrating to Jerusalem to this day, Aliyah, because Jerusalem, Mount Zion, is figuratively the highest place on earth. So wherever you come from, you're ascending to it. Lahodot l'shem Adonai, to praise God. Kishama yashivu chisaot lemishpat. Kisaot levet David. There, the thrones of rulership, or some would say the thrones of justice or judgment, stood thrones of the house of David. And this is interesting because it connects the religious figure of Jerusalem with the political figure of Jerusalem. And if we're talking about this from the standpoint of Galut, we're talking about the movement from the historical throne of David in the geographical city of Jerusalem to the messianic throne in the future Jerusalem that brings in the kingdom of God. And now one of the great word plays in all of biblical literature that is responsible for our refiguration of Jerusalem as the place of peace. Sha'alu, Shalom, Yerushalayim, Yishlayu, Ohavayich. It's just amazing the way the words are put together. So Sha'alu already has Shin and Lamed, Sha'alu, and which is translated here, pray, but a more accurate translation would be petition. Sha'al means to ask for something. Petition for Shalom Yerushalayim. And as soon as you see those two words together, you immediately connect the two etymologically and figuratively. Yerushalayim, the place of instruction and peace, where Shalom is taught. Yishlayu Ohavayach, where those who love you are safe. Yehi Shalom Bechelech, Shalva Ba'armenotayach. So the two words that are in verse 6, Shalom, are concretized in verse 7. Let there be peace within your ramparts. Let there be safety, security within your citadels. And it's not clear exactly what the etymologies are, but the likelihood is that Shalom and Shalva are both from the root Shalev, which means to be safe and secure. Why? Leman achai v're'ai, for the sake of my kin and my companions, my friends, let me pray for Jerusalem's peace. Adabra na shalom bach. Leman beit Adonai Eloheinu avakasha tov lach. I seek good for you for the sake of the house of Adonai our God. And again, I want to remind you that the house of Adonai our God can be understood literally as the temple, but it can be understood the way Zion is understood, as a figurative place, any place where we understand the presence of God to dwell. Now I'd like to look at some commentary on this that talks about its religious significance for post-biblical times, and then I'll go back and talk about the interpretation of Radak, of David Kimchi. So this Masachet Derech Eretz, one of the minor tractates of the Talmud, has a beautiful meditation on this psalm in the name of Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi. The Holy One said to Israel, although you have caused me to destroy my house and exile my children, seek her well-being, and I will take pity on you. So to whom is this being addressed? This isn't being addressed to anybody who possibly could be making a literal pilgrimage to the city of Jerusalem. No, this is addressed to us, to those of us who live in post-temple times following the exile, and whether we could go back to the geographical Eretz Israel or not. There's no temple there. But what we're being told is that Jerusalem now is a figure towards which we should pray, even in her destruction, because seeking the shalom, the well-being of Jerusalem, is a way of seeking, of doing penitence, of seeking God's pity on us. Pray for the well-being of the city, as it says, seek the welfare of the city in the book of Jeremiah. And may there be well-being within your ramparts. All of these prayers, and this beautiful statement at the end, Mi shehu ohev shalom, v'rodef shalom, parroting the characterization of Aaron in the Mishnah Avot. Those who love peace and pursue peace Umakdim shalom, who give priority to peace, umeshiv shalom, 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 shalom. Those who are just obsessed with peace. The Holy One grants this world and the world to come. So Yerushalayim becomes our trope, our meme, as it were, for seeking peace everywhere in the world in every respect as our highest priority. And when we do that, then we gain God's favor. Now to the commentary of Radak, David Kimchi, who lived in Provence, 1160 to 1235, and I think it's fair to say that he is the greatest of the medieval Jewish Psalms commentators. And he starts right out by identifying the Psalm with us. HaMizmor Hazeh, Ma'amar B'nei HaGalut. This Psalm is an utterance of the exile. Me'rov ta'avatam levinyan Beit HaMikdash. Because of their great yearning for the rebuilding of the temple, they recall the pilgrimages, adopting the tone of their ancestors who lived in the time of the temple. And it says, I rejoiced, samachti, because each and every one of us is supposed to be saying that, samachti. Now let's go on through the commentary to see how he relates this psalm to our relationship with the city of Jerusalem, yearning for its restoration and recognizing it as the place that manifests peace and presence. The exiles say, that's us, Kishehaita benuya Yerushalayim, v'haita hashchina betocha, kama haita mehulala. The Shekhinah was within her. How praiseworthy was she? Where will you find another city like it? For the whole community of Israel was joined together there 3 times a year. Who has seen a city such as this? So Kimchi interprets, Ana timtza ir kamoha shechubra la adat Yisrael. So the city being unified isn't a reference to the reunification in a political sense of the 2 parts of being Jerusalem being joined together, or Ir David being unified with the outer city, or whatever you want to understand by the term unified. It refers to the unification of the people in Jerusalem, the whole community assembling there together as one, with one voice, to seek peace and presence 3 times a year. Who's seen any city such as that to which the tribes would make pilgrimage? And the tribes would all ascend there, followers of God's commandments, and Jerusalem could contain them all. That proved to Israel that God had elected them. Haita edut liYisrael. So he's taking the words of the psalm, a testimonial to Israel. Sheha'el yitbarach bachar bahem, of our election. To praise God's names for the miracle that God would show them, of which this was one. And the Mishnah says that despite the vast crowd there, no one found the place too confining to lodge in. The great miracle was that they could all stand in the court together, standing packed together, but with room to bow. Verse 5, the thrones of judgment stood. Why is thrones in plural? Lashon Rabim, Chad l'Shechina, Chad l'Malchei Beit David. One for the divine presence and one for the kings descended from David, the Davidic dynasty. They were there, and they'll be there again. So the yearning for the renewal of Davidic monarchy and divine presence in the temple is part of the petition and yearning of those of us in exile. Pray, Omrim b'nei hagalut, those of us in exile say, Sha'alu me'ha'el yitbarach shalom Yerushalayim. What is the peace of Jerusalem? What is the well-being of Jerusalem? Kibbutz hagaluyot, the ingathering of the exiles. Until the exiles are gathered, until we Jews are all located in Jerusalem, Lo yihya la shalom. There'll be no peace for her. Ki nilchamim aleha arelim v'yishmaelim. So here's David Kimchi in Provence saying that as long as the uncircumcised, which means the Christians, and the Ishmaelites, the Muslims, are fighting over it, Jerusalem can have no peace. I would say in modern times, as long as we're all fighting over it, whoever is fighting over it, there can be no peace, whether it's intra-Jewish or Jews versus Christians or Muslims or anyone. Until there's peace, the presence cannot be settled there. And until the presence is settled there, there can be no peace. So the psalm continues saying, may those who love you be at peace, referring to the Jews in exile who mourn its destruction, and referring to all of us now who must mourn the war that's ongoing. Yehi shalom b'cheileich, may there be well-being within your ramparts, that Israel might return to you, so that there will never again be war within your ramparts and citadels. Never again be war on this Yom Hazikaron. For the sake of my kin and my friends, every one of the exiles who says, for the sake of my fellow Jews who've been exiled from you, I pray for your well-being, that may return to dwell within you. And for the sake of the destroyed temple of our God, I seek God's goodness on your behalf. And that's one of the great commentaries on one of the most beautiful psalms that we have in the Psalter. And with that, I'd like to stop again for questions and comments.
Sorry, I just took a drink. This question, I think there's some of these things that you feel like are taken into other accounts. But what do you think of the Christian appropriation of Jewish symbols, including the Jerusalem temple, and the transformation of these symbols into Christian theology? Like, how does this play
I
out?
don't have any opinion on it. I don't have any opinion about that. I started out, but you must have missed that part of the talk.
Sorry.
Well, I started by talking about the way Zion is a very prominent place name.
Oh,
and that
came
it's
in right at
also
the end of that. Yes.
and it's also a name that's often given to churches as well as to synagogues, and that represents a response to the history of the reception of Jerusalem and its mythicization as a place of presence and peace. And then I also looked at the two most prominent passages in the New Testament that discuss the Christian appropriation of Jerusalem in Hebrews and in Revelation. And I can go back and we can look at those texts again if you like. But it's the history of reception is all of a piece. It all has to do with the mythicization of Jerusalem as a place that isn't merely a spot on the map, but also a metonymy for any place where worship takes place, and that is understood to be a place where God is present and a venue of peace and security and safety, as manifest in the etymological reinterpretation of the meaning of Jerusalem.
Well, and to that end, within our own liturgy, there's this sense that Zion is sometimes separate from Jerusalem, or at least they can both exist in the same one. Participant references the Kimitzion liturgy for out of Zion shall go forth the law, and out of the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. So
Zion is always identified with Jerusalem.
With Jerusalem.
The question is the big issue, which I think you're kind of getting at, is the religious aspect of Jerusalem and the political aspect, because there are the two separate aspects of Jerusalem. One as the seat of the Davidic throne, right, the royal seat, and the question of whether whether the restoration of the Davidic monarchy in the Messianic era is something that is to be desired. And the question is, how distinct is that from the religious significance and symbolism of Jerusalem, which is decoupled from the political aspect? And we see some of that decoupling already in biblical times. And for most of us, the decoupling of Jerusalem as a religious symbol from its political aspect is an important element, I think, in our own relationship with Jerusalem as more of a religious symbol than a political one.
Okay.
And I don't mean to I don't mean to insult the ardent Zionists among us, but what I'm doing is saying that these two aspects of Jerusalem already separable within the biblical tradition and then in the post-biblical traditions as well.
So they fulfill different kind of conceptual purposes.
Excellent. That's exactly right.
And I think that this is, more in that kind of realm of, contextualizing Kimhi particularly, that he is writing at the time of the Crusades. Is it possible that he is then using the shade of what is going on in between the fighting with Christians and Muslims in the Holy Land as a reflection of his own aspect on Jerusalem and Zion in this moment in the Psalm?
Yes, of course. As long as Jerusalem is under the sway of Christians and or Muslims, then Jewish restoration is impossible.
And
it's going to take some kind of divine intervention in order to remove the foreign element from Jerusalem and enable the Jewish element to prevail. And that's where the messianic figure comes in.
So seeing these two, that there's this war that's going on and we're not even part of it, that this is this element of praying for the peace, like we're not even in
Yes,
the
praying for
struggle.
the peace of Jerusalem. Exactly. It has that. It has an explicit political relationship with Kimchi, too, as you said, to the Crusades and to Muslim domination and to the miserable condition of the Jewish minority that's located there, even though the yearning for restoration and the yearning for pilgrimage and for return is still very prominent among Jews in diaspora.
And then just to wrap up in this section, and then so we can keep going forward. So I think that this goes back to a couple of questions ago. This idea of Jerusalem as a geographic entity rather than a mythical, and how do we continue to grapple with this? This geographic and mythical, and does it continue to play out? Like, and especially on a day like today, Yom Hazikaron, right before, are we still in this place where we're constantly thinking in terms of allegorical and
well, I can't speak for anybody but myself.
I'd like to hear your thoughts on this.
Look, in ancient times, in even pre-Israelite mythology, the city of the great king was a match for a kind of heavenly city of the God of the city. So you have the heavenly Jerusalem, which is the abode of the heavenly God, and then you have the earthly Jerusalem, which is the abode of the divine presence here on earth. And God graciously condescends to allow God's presence to be manifest for us here on earth. But there always is this bifurcation between the ideal Jerusalem, which is the heavenly Jerusalem, and the real Jerusalem, which is the Jerusalem whose streets you can walk upon. And there's always a vacillation, I think, in the human heart between the two, which is, to glory in the opportunity to walk in the earthly Jerusalem, to actually be, to be present there where God's presence was felt and God's presence was manifest. But to recognize that it's not the heavenly Jerusalem. It's not the ideal that we may have in our dreams and our imagination. And we yearn for that one, for the one that really is the place of eternal peace, where the tribes are all unified and all the Jews can go and be peacefully present in the presence of God. And I'm not saying we want to, reinstate the sacrifices there, but let's have a big barbecue anyway. join together in peace and in fellowship, the way the psalm envisions, Laman achai v're'ai, so that we can be together in a place of peace and security. So yes, I hold that image of the heavenly Jerusalem, the figurative Jerusalem, the place of peace and presence, the one that we just don't experience in our real world right now. I hold that in my heart.
I appreciate that. And I think that as we're contemplating this around Yom HaZikaron and Yom HaAtzmaut, that kind of that metaphysical idea too is so that while we're talking about a modern history, that there is all of this other kind of subtext we're carrying with us. Let's continue with your sources, and then we'll have questions at the end.
Thank you. Okay, so what I wanted to do for the rest of our time is look at some other biblical figurings of Jerusalem and just talk about them in relation to the images that we've looked at so far. So one of the most powerful biblical texts about Jerusalem is in Isaiah chapter 62. Now, here we are in the latter portion of the book of Isaiah, where we've had this tremendous controversy over whether or not the temple should be rebuilt. And we have the post-exilic community debating about the nature of its identity. And here's the prophet, third Isaiah, who was functioning in the Persian period, talking about Jerusalem. Laman Zion lo echasheh, shall not be silent about Jerusalem. Laman Yerushalayim lo eshkot. So remember, I mentioned that you see Zion and Yerushalayim in poetic parallelism, and it's clearly the same place that we're talking about. Ad yetzei chanoga tzidka vishuata kelapid yiv'ar. Now, this is an absolutely astonishing image. Till her victory emerged resplendent. Notice the JPS translation translates tzedek as victory, and her triumph like a flaming torch. Now, earlier in the talk, I talked about the pre-Israelite deities who are associated with Jerusalem, and one of them is the deity who's called tzedek. And I talked about the way in which tzedek, as the name of a god, comes to signify a characteristic of Jerusalem, which is Jerusalem's justice or judgment or righteousness, and here translated victory. And now you have this shining image, which is associated with tzedek, because tzedek originally was an astral deity, a deity that was a producer of light. And so victory being figured here as splendid, as shining, is a recrudescence, a reemergence of the image of the pre-Israelite God of Jerusalem here transformed into an utterly Jewish sentiment. The shining of righteousness and victory. Yeshuata, translated triumph, but we all know that this word has a lot of meaning, not only victory, but also salvation, like a flaming torch. So the old astral character of the deity, who was a patron deity of the city in pre-Israelite times, emerges here as a gorgeous poetic figure in Isaiah's poetry. V'ra'u goyim tzidkech, the nations shall see your victory, and all kings your glory. Glory is a term for the physical, concrete manifestation of something that's visible. So the flaming Jerusalem is a visible image of victory and judgment for the entire world that's going to see that, and it'll be called by a new name that Adonai will bestow, which is exactly the same as the image of the New Jerusalem that we saw in Revelation chapter 21. So the Jewish image prefigures the Christian image. V'hayit ateret tiferet b'yad Adonai u'tzlif melucha v'chaf Elohayach. A glorious crown in the hand of God. We're not talking about David here. We're talking about a kind of divine kingship, a divine kingship over the city, manifest in the city in this glorious era of victory. The divine victory is also in Psalm 24 here. Psalm 24, which is the psalm that we recite when we return the Torah to the Ark in the Ashkenazic liturgy during festivals that take place on weekdays, as opposed to the use of Psalm 29 on Shabbat. And you probably all know this psalm. Se'u sha'arim rashechem v'hi nasa'u pitchei olam v'yavo melech hakavod. Mize melech hakavod Adonai Yizuz v'gibor Adonai Gibor Milchama. So these are the gates of the temple that are being admonished to raise up so that the victorious king, that is to say, God, having achieved victory over the forces of chaos, the enemies of Israel, can enter. There's a kind of open sesame taunt to the king here. Who can come in? Lift up your heads. Who is this King of glory? Who is it? Adonai Izus Gibor, the divine warrior. So in an ancient text, Psalm 24, we see a precursor to the later text, Isaiah 62, in which we have victory manifesting from Jerusalem here in the return of the divine warrior from battle, summoning the gates to lift up, so that the King of glory, that is to say, the God whose presence is manifest in the temple, may enter it. In order to enter, what you have to have is the right name. Adonai Yizuz v'gibor, Adonai Gibor Milchama, valiant in battle, mighty and valiant. Mi hu ze melech hakavod, who is the King of glory? Adonai Tzvaot, the divine warrior, is the glorious King who enters the temple. So victory is achieved so that peace can be manifest in the temple because of the vindication that takes place on the part of the divine warrior. And finally, Psalm 48, which we recite on Monday. Psalm 48. Gadol Adonai u'mehulal me'od be'ir Eloheinu har kodsho. So God is great and much praised in the city of our God, God's holy mountain, Yefei Nof, most beautiful, beautiful of view, Mitzos kol haaretz, the joy of the whole world, Har Tzion, Yarketei Safon, Kiryat Melech Rav. It's this incredible, a very, very choppy, pithy, rhythmical description of the city of Jerusalem, Har Tzion, Yarketei Safon, summit of Safon, which is a co-opting of the name of the abode of the Canaanite god Baal for Israel's God. Elohim ba'armanoteha noda lemiskav. And then the symmetrical repeat of the admonition to tour the city, Sobu Tzion v'hakifuha. Walk around Zion, circle it, circumambulate. Remember the song I sang at the beginning of the talk? Will come fathers, won't you be determined? We'll shout and go round, we'll shout and go round the walls of Zion. The walls of Zion, note it, note its beauty. Leman tisaparu l'dor acharon, so that you can tell of it in a future age. Well, that's the future age in which we now live. And so we've seen I hope adequately I've been able to show you the way in which Jerusalem is refigured in the biblical tradition and in the post-biblical tradition, both Jewish and Christian, to represent an absolutely incredible and powerful mythical symbol that's transportable from the geographical spot to represent any place in which we acknowledge the indwelling of God's presence and in which we yearn for the peace that's signified by the city of Jerusalem on earth. So I want to make sure there's time for questions and comments.
Wonderful. And please send your questions to me. I think that in the last 50 years, 50 plus years, 55, of Jerusalem that is unified, how do you think that have you seen kind of contemporary commentators shifting the way that we're addressing this sense of Jerusalem in myth and reality? Like, is there, the mythical version is still there? As you said, it's always this place that we're working to achieve. What would you say the ways in which that myth has shifted at all, if it has, in this time period of a unified Jerusalem in which Jews are living in?
I don't see any difference. I mean, I'm not a modernist.
Fair.
My interests and expertise are in the ancient history of reception and not in. I mean, I'm sure everybody in the figurative room here would have their own opinions about the relationship between Jerusalem in its present political situation and the history of the city and the kind of figurative or idealization or mythicization that I've spoken about. Each person probably will have their own view. But I've already told you my view,
Right.
which is that I tend to dissociate the current political state of the city from my religious conception of it. And that's, for better or worse. And I recognize that it's a bit schizophrenic to say that because there it is, right?
I mean, that is part of the nature of being Jewish, though, the cognitive dissonance and.
Well, that's a good word for it. Yeah, that cognitive dissonance in the sense that one has a certain kind of expectation that is perpetually thwarted.
A question from our group here is, how do we mourn for Jerusalem when the city has never been bigger, more splendid, et cetera? And thinking specifically about, say, the 9th of Av, or these times in which we are supposed to take on kind of mourning as a community, a communal mourning practice.
There was
today is a great example of that. Today is a day of communal mourning.
There was a group of Karaites who were actually, their whole liturgy was rooted in mourning for Jerusalem, and they were called the Avei Zion, the mourners for Jerusalem. And their liturgy consisted entirely of ramens. But of course, we think about Yerushalayim HaBenuyah in religious terms as Jerusalem with the Davidic monarchy reinstated and with the temple rebuilt and with the sacrificial cult restored. And I think there are Jews who still yearn for those things, but most of us have foregone those yearnings, for a monarchy and for the temple with sacrifices to be rebuilt. But we have every reason to mourn for the sorrows of the Jewish past, things that terrible tragedies that our ancestors have endured, from the destruction of the temple through various other tragedies that are commemorated on Tisha B'Av and on Yom HaShoah. And the various destructions that Jerusalem endured, whether it be in the time of the First Temple, or the time of the Second Temple, or the time of the Crusades, or uh, uh, in times of modern warfare, still are worth mourning and commemorating at the time of Tisha B'Av. And then there's mourning for the gulf between the ideal that we yearn for and the reality that we experience. Whatever that ideal might be, I presume it's something different than what we're now experiencing.
In our movement, conservative Judaism, there's not an active call to rebuild a physical temple and restore sacrificial worship. And yet we do have calls for that in our liturgy that remain. How can we analogize our love and hope to return to Jerusalem, which still exists, with this desire to kind of separate from what that means for to actually recreate and rebuild a temple? Like, we're not, and to be clear, there are numbers of Jews all over the world who are calling for a third temple movement and those sorts of things. But that's not, when we're remembering Jerusalem, that's not where that is. So how do we balance that?
The two terms that I use are presence and peace. What does Jerusalem mean in my religious life? Jerusalem is the place where I feel, where I have an experience of God's presence. Is that that could be anywhere, but it's figured by Jerusalem because that's the locus of divine presence according to our tradition. And Jerusalem is particularly associated with what you already said, Ki mitzion tetzei Torah, right, from Isaiah. That the source of divine teaching, of God's teaching, comes from this figurative Jerusalem, which I guess is a kind of a partner to Sinai as a source of teaching. And when I yearn for that teaching, when I learn that teaching, when I engage in that teaching, then I'm in this mythic Jerusalem. And when I have that feeling of peace that comes from time to time, usually when I'm immersed in learning or when I'm engaged with a wonderful group like this one that's engaged in study, then I feel a sense of peace. I feel a sense of remove from the turmoil that's going on out there. And that's why I say it's such a blessing, such a privilege to be able to teach and learn Torah with you good people.
Well, as we're kind of wrapping up, is there anything you'd like to add before we close today?
I think I've said pretty much. I wanted to leave time for questions and comments from people who are here. And if you look at the bottom of the handout, you'll see that I've recommended a couple of very good books that you can read about Jerusalem for further study. It's certainly worth it. Ellie brought up some very good points about particular historical moments in Jerusalem that are of great significance for the development of the Jewish people. And those are really well characterized in good popular essays in Nitsa Rosovsky's book there, City of the Great King. I love that book. And all the best authorities about Jerusalem. The only thing it's lacking is anything about the past 30 years or so, because it was published in 1996, and a lot has gone on in Jerusalem since 1996 that you want to catch up on. But for that, you've got the newspaper.
Maybe if enough of us start looking into this particular book, they'll do a new edition, which will then have the last 30 years too. Who's to
That would be nice. That would be nice.
We're just looking for an edited and updated version. I want to thank you so much for taking time out and sharing with us and sharing with our community of learners. It is always delightful to hear from you, Dr. Cooper, and you always give us so much to think about in the realm of of just how biblical kind of history and tradition work together, and the ways in which they continue to reverberate today. So thank you for sharing with us.
Thank you all.
Just as a quick outro, I want to thank everyone for coming today, and note that there's a small schedule change again. I'm sure Tani said this at the beginning, that next week our session will be with Dr. Elias Sachs, director of the Jewish Publication Society, on Gender, the Bible, and the Art of Translation. And then we'll have Dr. Summer's session on Shavuot on June 3rd. And today's session, I want to thank Yale Asbel again for his Navi level donation. And thanks again, everyone, for joining us.